Okay, so we started class reminding everyone what soapstones was. There it is. And you've already done SOA and you did P, but you hadn't read the book yet. So I'm having you think of 5 specific arguments that you think this book has, 5 purposes that he has. And because I think we get caught up and we think, oh, it's to end slavery. Slavery is bad. Yes, that is one of his purposes, but he's got these smaller arguments along the way that add up to that one. So in your notes, write down 5 of those purposes. A lot of what he was doing too was implied, like he doesn't fully come out and attack slavery in the way that we are used to in 2021. There isn't like the kind of nuance of looking at this argument that we are used to, but merely by the fact of his crafting this narrative the way he does, he makes this argument. So it is implied throughout. And then there are moments where he it's like he is addressing a counter argument without fully saying it. So it's interesting how kind of careful he is about that argument.
There's like a difference between like an abolitionist and civil rights.
Yes.
So that's kind of where I was going with that.
Right. Well, and I think absolutely, and I think like a good example of like who he was speaking to was like someone like Abraham Lincoln, who was, he was racist in a lot of ways. I think we could expect that. But he was also an abolitionist. So Frederick Douglass is trying to like very carefully balance this idea of getting people on this side. All right, what are some other arguments we should put up here? Yeah, Max.
I was thinking about how religion covers up evil.
Okay, good.
It's kind of a lesser argument, but he does bring up religion a lot.
Yeah, let's look at this idea right here and try and clarify that a little bit. So by covers up evil, what do you mean by that?
Like creates a way for people to hide what they're actually doing.
Okay. A way to hide the reality of their actions.
Yeah.
Right, cool. Yeah.
I'd say it's just an excuse, like I can do this because I love God.
Yeah, he uses this word over and over again. Yeah. I'm pious, so that must excuse all of my actions. You know, if I have faith in God, then this is obviously okay. Noah?
Well, can we change the argument a little bit? Because he is a religious man. He talks about his God and providence. He quotes the Bible.
Yeah.
So he definitely believes in the Bible. I think it was specifically like the hypocrisy of Southern Christianity.
Yes.
And the reason why I think that's more of an argument is that that's going to help with like the North going to war against the South.
Yeah.
Is that it's because like the people in the North are using Christianity to say slavery is wrong, and he is someone who is a Christian, and he talks about the ministers that the slaves liked, and so I think that the Southern Christianity had taken sort of a reroute to justify slavery.
Yes.
And I think that he's saying Christianity in itself is and that's why he has such a hard time with it. Because if he thought that Christianity was like inadvertently pro-slavery, he wouldn't be practicing.
Right.
And so I think that he's trying to discuss to like the North and be like, look at how these guys treat their religion. Because Abraham Lincoln did the same thing. He said half of you are praying to win the war to free the slaves, and half of you are praying to free your slaves. Like,
Right.
He actually said that in the
This is in his second inaugural. Yeah.
And so I think that it would be important like, to state it that way, because he's going to say not all religion justifies evil because he's
Yeah, and I think it's both. It's like he's talking about the way that people envision themselves as religious people. And so in that way, it's like a display of religiosity, let's say. It's real.
It is? I don't know about
Look it up. Display, I don't know if I spelled it wrong, but a display of religiosity. So like a display of piety is this way to cover up evil. And then he has this separate argument that the actual way that Southern Christianity is being practiced in certain churches by certain ministers is wrong. It's an incorrect interpretation of the Bible. And Noah's totally right. He was like a practicing Christian. And when we read the appendix, if you have or not, you'll see how he's talking about this a little bit more. Yeah, Lexi.
Excuse me, but I've kind of noticed that I actually don't have this one written down, just kind of popped in my head. Is that throughout the book, Frederick Douglass seems
still a little, for lack of a better word, hesitant when talking about white people. It's kind of like, for example, when someone has wronged you and you're like trying to forgive them, you're still kind of like, they did this and this and this, but like, I guess they're still like a good person, whatever. And I've noticed he kind of did that throughout the book. And he published this book in 1845. And this was still around the time where racism was still a huge thing. There may not have been as much slavery. Racism was
Well,
still-
1845 is before the Civil War, so slavery is still rampant. Yeah,
That's never mind.
yeah.
But
You're right. There's
Yeah.
like, even for people who are against slavery, there's still a lot of racism.
yeah, and so there's just a lot of like that dehumanization going on, and so he's still kind of a little bitter, like this is still going on. And so,
Yeah.
I think kind of an argument he's kind of making out, intentionally making it, is that white people are not super great.
I think I like that way of saying it. Is that what I should write on the board? I feel like that might be taken out of context for someone who walks by. White people aren't super great. I think there is an argument here, though, that
Like, why are they?
systemic
Put that in
racism
white people.
leads to a justification of slavery, right? Because it's about like an attitude that people have, the racism that people have, that then justifies the systems that they put in place around that racism. And so that, I don't know if he's arguing that or if he's arguing the opposite, that slavery has created this sense of racism, but I think that he is discussing that kind of like chicken or the egg.
Well, I like
thing.
that a lot better. The other way kind of tells him being racist. White people, which isn't that all he wants to do.
Right.
No, but I also
I
think
just
he's
didn't know
not
how to
about,
word that,
no, you're
because
right,
that
but like,
doesn't not at all.
but I think he's also not about this idea of like love the sin. Well, what is it? Love the sin, hate the sinner. That's a fun one. Yes, hate the sin, love the sinner. He is not about that. Like, he is not a forgiving person about the systems. Like, even for Sophia Old, he's not like, but she was kind underneath, so like it's okay. Ultimately, she's a good person. She just was in this thing. It was like, no, she was fundamentally changed by being a slave holder, and that is inexcusable, right? So there's also like this very like hard line where he's not going to like look at the people in the South and say like, oh, but they could change. It's more what Lexi is saying. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's not a good way to word it.
No, I like it. I think it would be funny to write up here, but yeah, Ashton.
Just like slavery does not like necessarily be bring prosperity. Like you can not have like slavery in the system.
Yes. Yes, that is so important at the end, prosperity, because it is a way that he was sort of caught off guard by the North. He thought he would come to the North and that they would be impoverished because they don't have slavery, right? And they've been taught all for years and years that like slavery is what is creating economic development. And yet what it actually seems to be doing is creating economic disparity. The people who own slaves own acres and acres and acres of land, and they're doing great, but then it also creates this like system of poverty too. So slavery does not necessarily equal prosperity is a really important part of the final couple chapters of this book. Any other arguments that you're thinking of in this book, smaller arguments that can add up to slavery is bad? Taya?
It's a simple one. It's just like stand up.
Okay, good. Stand up for yourself. Yeah, there's this idea, like he's got this idea of give me liberty or give me death, he even quotes that. And I think his idea is that like humanity will do anything for freedom. And yeah, some people have been broken down, but ultimately they're all trying to like achieve that track. So stand up for yourself, I think is a big important thing. Yeah.
I think along with that, like towards the beginning, he looks at a bunch of other slaves and they sing as an act of rebellion.
Yeah.
And as an act of like their own morale.
Yeah.
And so, one, I see, like their physical rebellion in their singing, and also in them being religious. Like it creates a standpoint of, if we are religious and we believe in this, you do too, what makes us so different?
Yeah, I think like an important part of this narrative too is that slaves aren't just being complacent. They're not just like sort of saying like, oh well, I've given up all hope, I guess I'm just going to go along with things. There are constant acts of small rebellion, and they're rebelling where they can, either through religion or learning to read or write, or through singing or whatever. They're trying to like at least challenge the system a little. Yeah.
Another one I put was don't underestimate anyone.
Yeah.
And that kind of, it does refer to like him having like his potential and stuff, but also refers to like the woman's name, but how like he like was owned by her in the beginning, and she was like really nice and sweet, but like he underestimated her power, I guess, or the way she could change.
Yes.
And just how different like slavery made her. And I think that's he underestimated her.
Yeah, okay, so don't underestimate anyone and like the amount of power that one single human being can have. Noah?
I just kind of felt like there was a power of family.
Uh-huh.
One of the first things he describes is his like family line, at least as far as he knows it, and that's like really empowering to him. Like, I know who my mother is, and that's not like a luxury that most slaves even have.
Mhm.
And then the way that he kind of does like, not footnotes, but like he parenthesizes like my wife's cousin, as he's just like telling the story. Like, I feel like
Yes.
that's important to be like, well, you know, like my aunt's husband, like he throws that in there a lot, just
Yeah.
kind of like how he's related to this person story about. He also talks a lot about, he gets a wife in the book.
Yeah.
That was really important to him, like how that he had the ability to marry a free black woman.
Yeah.
And I just felt like there was a lot of like discussion of how important family is for this. And even we talked about this in the group, and said like he kind of says like, you know, he doesn't feel family is important because of slavery. Like, there you go. Like, slavery has made it so that he can't feel the importance of family bonds, but otherwise he does like maybe he overcame it almost, but like it kind of seems like I made this connection a lot as I was reading the book, but they treated like dogs like that. You're a slave, you know, like that was horrifying to me. But it's like it's like the cranking out the slaves. You know, it's like they split up families on purpose, and because of that, there's a strong family tie of like I need to feel like I'm in a family, I fit in.
Yeah.
I have cousins, like I have brothers, and so I feel like that was really something that he made a connection throughout the entire.
Yeah, and I think like his sort of emphasizing how the family is broken up over and over again is his way of emphasizing that it does have a lot of power, and that slaveholders recognize that power, and that's part of their motivation for breaking up families. Yeah. Okay. So I think you've got a lot, and I think there's more even than this, and I've got one that I want to talk about in a little bit. But if you don't have 5 written down, take some of these and write them down, because you want to have a lot of options when it comes to writing a paper about this book. So write down the argument. All right, and then over the course of the book, I think you have learned quite a lot about the speaker. So you're going to take some notes now about what you know about Frederick Douglass now that you have read this book. Like, think about personality traits, who he is as a person. You know the things that have happened to him now, at least in early life. What you're trying to think about is like what he reveals about himself as a person. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write down as much as you can about Frederick Douglass as a person. Okay, go ahead. He starts as a little kid, but then he gets out at 20 something. I think it would have been like 22. Noah, did you pull up those notes?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was like,
Sorry.
Can I check online? Dr. Ford, was Canvas working for you last night? It wasn't working for me too.
The district is fixing teams,
Oh,
so like all of the
That's why everything was
district stuff
down.
is down.
So smart.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but 2 minutes about the speaker. What do you know about?
They could have done it already.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm so dumb.
No, you're not.
Closed by the S.
You know, terms and values. I have like a bunch of
Guys, I thought we already did it. Oh, thank you.
Were you looking for it? I had like a bunch of sticky notes and they were like on my paper. Just like, if you like shook it out, or you shake out your book. I didn't take it. Don't accuse me.
It's on your book. There was a certain word that I think it's very
All right. All right, tone. Tone is the way the author feels about a subject. So you wrote down a whole, I know this was a while ago, but you wrote down a whole bunch of things that are part of the subject. I think you could even add to that now that you've read the book, right? So you're trying to think of the different tone words that correspond with those things. Like when I think of what is his attitude towards family, I think of kind of like devastated, a kind of feeling of like missing out on something important. What would that be? Like a lack of a longing is a good word. I was thinking FOMO and I was like, that's not appropriate. Like, I'm like, that's not what he's thinking, but longing is a really good word. All right. So a feeling of longing towards family, power. I think there's a sense of pride there, right? So we've got all these different tones that would correspond to the different subjects in the book. So I'm going to give you about a minute, and the way, or exactly a minute, the way you're going to write this is like, if you're writing about power, write it like that. So you've got the subject and then the tone word that corresponds with that subject. Just make a list of what you can. Okay, 1 minute, go ahead.
Uses very often like contrast.
Okay, did you get done? Some good tone words. All right. Okay, the last one is style. And style is the stuff that we have been talking about since we started talking about this book. Style is the rhetorical strategies that a writer is using to convey their argument. So we've been talking about how he has appeals to pathos. Pathos isn't a strategy in itself, and I need to be really clear about this moving forward. Pathos is something that you create in your audience, or you appeal to them in. Like, let's say, how can I explain this? So everyone has a sense of like a value system, right? And you wouldn't say, oh, in this paper, I am creating your values, or I am using your values. You're not, you're trying to appeal to those values that I have, right? So pathos is like what your audience has. They have this like sense of pathos. Logos, they have this sense of logos. They have a rational brain, and you are appealing to their sense of logos. Or ethos, they want to be able to trust you as a writer. So you are appealing to their sense that they can trust you as a writer. So all three of those are about like something that you are appealing to in your audience, but you're using style to create those feelings in your audience. So for example, to appeal to pathos, he is using a ton of imagery. He uses a lot of repetition. He uses a lot of parallelism, And you could even say, like, these don't have to be just one word. You could be thinking about how he talks about whipping a lot and how that would be an appeal to pathos. Or he talks about, he makes a lot of allusion to Christ, like at the very end when he talks about how he was resurrected and left the tomb, and so there's all sorts of different strategies that he's using throughout his book. These can be some of the rhetorical strategies that we've had as word of the day, like anaphora or hypophora or any of those, but these can also just be sort of common sense, or things that you just recognize, like, oh, he starts by talking about his birth, and then about halfway through he introduces this idea of Christianity, and that seems like a rhetorical strategy he's using. Yeah.
Like in like an essay, if you're writing about it this way, we'd say like he uses imagery, and then we'd say like this imagery is whipping or something. Like not in that way, but we say like what it is, and then this the example, I guess.
Yes, you
So
can,
you
and
can't just use like,
I wouldn't just say imagery. I would identify the pattern in the images.
or can
yeah.
we do either one? Like, I mean, the other way where we just use the example. I
Yes, yes, and if you just say, oh, he repeats image, or he repeats like instances of whipping over and over again to appeal to pathos or something like that.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, but what I want you to do now is I want you to just take 2 minutes and write down all of the different ways that you think Frederick Douglass is trying to persuade his audience. So that's what rhetorical strategy means. It just means different ways that he is trying to persuade his audience, and try and make a big long list of them. All right, go ahead. And you can do this in your groups too. Different ways that different things that he's doing in his writing to appeal to his audience, to convince his audience of his message.
We're using
Yeah.
Do you like true crime?
I love it.
So,
Of course.
Addie was going on like a tangent, like for hours.
Addie?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's obsessed with it.
Does she talk about it in class too?
Uh-huh.
He like uses like experiences that we all like know of. Like we know what it feels like to have some sort of power.
I know what it
and,
feels
like,
like to get
or,
Hopefully not.
like on the other end, like we know what it's like to feel someone. Or like we know what it's like to use excuses.
We're all here today. You are always here.
I'm many times. I'm usually
The person that was sitting here, which I was I don't remember anymore. All I remember was the outfit. We were like talking about our outfits and what we were trying to convey. I can't remember. I remember what I was wearing. Yeah.
You're wearing a band. No, you're wearing Pathos, you were wearing the green shirt.
Yeah, that's what I was.
All right, this was just the first time you're brainstorming about this. We're gonna perfect this over the next few classes. So you are gonna have to write a paper about Frederick Douglass. The assignment is just going to be, what persuasive strategies does Frederick Douglass use to convey his argument? Like, it is just as basic as that. I'm gonna phrase it similar to an AP test. What was that? Yeah, it's and it's not directly after Fulbright. You gotta look after. Yeah, I think it'll be like November 1st, around there. November 1st and 2nd. When it's due. Yeah, we'll be starting it. We're like kind of starting it like right now. So, yeah. All right, so so when you are writing a thesis statement where you're trying to convey what the rhetorical strategies are, like how is this guy being persuasive? The way that you do it is you combine a statement of purpose with observations about the style. So you say something like, Douglass argues this through these strategies. And that creates the thesis statement for a rhetorical analysis.
So we literally just use this.
Yeah, I wouldn't use like, I am not a big fan of like templates. I don't want all your thesis statements to sound like this, but this is like the basic building blocks
Is
of
it
a good
fine if we
thesis.
do use the word argues, just in
Yeah.
general, like?
Yeah, You can use argues or, yeah, if you're trying to make it fancy, like postulates or something. Yeah, no, it's okay to use argues. So what you want to do is you want to think of what his specific argument is though. So if you try to write a paper about how he argues slavery is bad, you are going to have a paper that quickly gets out of control because you're going to have to account for all the different ways that slavery is bad. But if you narrow it down and you only choose the argument that you find most interesting, then you're gonna have a lot easier time writing this paper. So for me, the one I'm most interested in isn't up here yet. I'm gonna put it up here as number 11.
It's probably about two.
For me, the power of rhetoric and the power of language and communication is a really important part of this book. He's talking about growing up and learning how to speak the way that Northerners would want him to speak for conveying his arguments about slavery, you know? So I think he's got this story about how I was born and I was born into these ineffective forms of rhetoric, like whipping and singing, the kinds of forms of rhetoric that work within a group, but don't work to communicate between groups. And so I had to learn to be able to communicate to the people in power. And that's why I had to learn to read and I had to learn to write. And once I was able to do those things, I was able to be inspired by the abolitionists. I was able to write my own paths. I was able to escape into freedom. And then I was able to build a whole career off speaking and writing, you know? So I think that becomes like a huge important argument here.
I think like one part of the book that really stood out to me was like how he basically almost escaped, like not actually escaping, but like he kind of argued with his master that like, hey, I'm working, why can't I just like pay you at the end of the week? And
Yes.
so he was kind of free for like a fee, like
Right, but it was like that first step into actually becoming
Yeah.
free was him like arguing with his slave master and convincing him that this is what you should do and it's going to be more profitable for you. And it's an instance of him using rhetoric to get what he wanted, right? So I think that becomes a really important argument here. And so I'm going to force us all for just a second. This isn't the one I want you to write your paper on, unless it is also very interesting to you. But just as an example, I want you to try and write a statement of purpose about the power of language and communication. So what you want to do is you want to say, what I want you to write down just on your paper is, what is Frederick Douglass's argument about rhetoric? What is his argument about the power of persuasion? And write down what you think that might be. And we're going to go through it for a second. So you're writing down a statement of purpose, like an argument that he has.
Isn't that what that is?
This just says it's powerful, but I'm asking like, what is the power of it, or why is it powerful, or what does it lead to?
Is that what goes in the specific
You
argument
say
or
that
the
there's
strategy?
physical rhetoric, huh?
What?
You say there's like physical rhetoric?
Yeah. Yeah, and you're just writing it in your notes. This is just I'm just going to demonstrate to you how I would write a thesis, and this would be the first part for me.
Okay, so this is.
So right now I am going to demonstrate how I would write a thesis, but I'm making you like do it along with me. And so my subject that I'm interested in this book is the power of rhetoric. So now I am making you write down, what do you think is his argument about the power of rhetoric? Like, what is he's kind of saying like why rhetoric is powerful. How would he answer that question? These are all very good arguments. once you got it, we're gonna do a word of the day. It'll apply, I promise. Do you have space for a word of the day?
Yeah.
Does anyone need one? Remember if we did this last year in 10th grade or not, if you were in the 10th grade class? Let me pass this back. Sorry, it doesn't have a hole punch, you just can use one. Our word of the day is Bildungsroman. It's German.
We've got to stop making up
What if I did that? What if the whole year I was just like,
So you see.
I was like, this is my last year teaching. I'm just gonna like ruin their lives.
Do it.
Wait, are you not teaching this year?
Bills.
No, I am. I was just saying that would be fun as a kind of rebellion. Yeah.
Considering we come to school and listen to what all of our teachers say.
Bildungsroman. It's German. All right. So a Bildungsroman is a story that deals with one person's formative years. Shows the psychological you're so dumb.
What?
Or moral growth of someone. So in English, and a little bit more informally, we would probably call this a coming of age story. All right, so a story that deals with one person's formative years shows the psychological or moral growth of someone. It's a coming of age story. So basically, a Bildungsroman is one character who usually experiences at the beginning or is coming from a place of, actually, before we do this, let's get the whole definition.
Is Zootopia a Bildungsroman?
Yeah, usually it starts when the person is, well, that starts when she's young. Yeah, it's kind of a Zootopia. Yeah, it kind of is.
I feel like
Are we watching a
Zootopia just fits into everything. What?
Are we watching a
Zootopia is the most advanced form of rhetoric.
At the end, no.
Zootopia is the only.
I think we should.
All right, you got the definition written down? So your example is narrative of Frederick Douglass.
What is after formative
years.
Years. Yeah, can't you read my handwriting? Years.
Sometimes.
That's an R.
Well, you write how I write, and sometimes I can't read my own. So.
All right, so the example again is narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I think this is a Bildungsroman. I think we start when he's young. He describes how he comes of age and how he achieves the kind of like consciousness about his condition. And then in the end, it's got the same purpose that shows a moral growth. So I will show you how this works here.
So also like the monster of the
The what?
Only in the movie.
Oh, I don't know.
Only in the movie.
You haven't seen the Lorax? No.
Oh my God. You have to watch that too.
All right, so
It's actually a very effective form of rhetoric about global warming.
yeah, I've heard. All right, so under effects, you're gonna write down, really small, you're gonna write down what like characteristics this genre usually has. So we talked about a slave narrative being a genre, and a lot of slave narratives also probably would qualify as Bildungsromans. So number one, you start at the beginning with someone who experiences emotional loss, and often this is the loss of parents.
And this is under.
So
effect.
a
So
lot,
Batman then.
yeah, a
Wait a
lot
second.
of like, a lot of coming of age stories, they start with like orphans. They start with people who do not have like parent.
Every Marvel movie.
Okay. They start with people who do not have like a parent that can like lead them very carefully through life, and so they have to like get that on their own. And yes, you're right, most Disney movies work this way with parents that have died.
We all sections.
You're writing it under effects, yeah. Number two, they go on, this pushes characters on a journey. And the journey can be metaphorical or it can be literal. Like we're gonna read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, that's a literal journey, they're going down a river. But for this one, it's probably more a psychological journey, but he actually does go on physical journeys from master to master, right? And part of that is that they do experience
Kung Fu Panda 2.
like different episodes in their life. So like for each person that they meet along their journey, it kind of serves as this different episode, and each episode provides like a new step to their moral development.
This is literally vampire.
So were cars
I was
classified
really
as-
I don't know, I haven't seen Cars either.
Oh,
You guys gotta remember that I'm so much older than you, so I haven't seen all your childhood movies.
Well, I still watch it.
Well, watch it.
It's not a
Well, I
true
didn't see when I was in high
dragon,
school, but it's when I stopped watching those.
Why?
Is this like every
Cars about
origin story? of
cars.
Everybody.
Walk out, walk out.
Literally
Alright.
I might have to drop this.
Wait,
mic.
Wait, have you watched Mean Girls though?
Yeah, that's about probably, yeah, I watched. My childhood movies were like Neverending Story and The Dark Crystal.
Ew, I hate
Lapras,
that.
Also
The never-ending story.
Star Wars Empire Strikes Back.
That's
Okay, I'll start with.
that was also awesome.
All right, so the goal ultimately for these stories is maturity.
Harry Potter.
And the way Harry Potter is like the most, at this point, the most famous children's one, yeah. The way that like they achieve maturity is by like, what's the word? Like negotiating.
Well, we don't see that like the Lego Star Wars.
There's-
Yeah.
All right, guys. All right, it's by negotiating this kind of balance with the social order. So usually by the very end, the character accepts traditions and rules of society.
Where they blow up the Death Star.
Some people have parents.
No, Star Wars is not a children's
Are you sure?
Luke
and
Leia.
Where they
This is
kill
like
the
a
Lord.
kid,
Yeah, I'm positive.
Wait, why?
Are you sure the prequels aren't?
The prequels might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I said. I said that.
He's separated from his mother for
With,
like
like-
10 years, like
No, I'm
15
talking about like
years.
the
Then he comes back and his mom dies.
Okay.
That's
I
really
don't
not
know.
who you're driving.
Star
It's
Wars.
okay.
Yeah, no, I don't remember.
It's a hero's journey.
The prequels are based off of Frederick stuff. That's all I'm saying.
All right, so do you guys see how this sort of like develops? We got this emotional loss, developing, like go through this journey where they meet different people who teach them different things. They're kind of like, usually they're like kind of a rebel to begin with, and then they are slowly sort of integrated into
This is
society.
totally how to treat a dragon.
They're slowly integrated into society and they accept this idea of a social order. So for Frederick Douglass, he starts with loss of parents. He starts with the emotional loss of his identity and his freedom. I mean, he never had it, but he recognized it as a loss at the beginning, and he talks about that. He goes on a journey to different slave masters, and he has to experience these different episodes that teach him different things about life as he goes through. And the ultimate goal here is maturity, but maturity only comes about for him through freedom, right? A total freedom to actually create his own identity and actually live his own identity. And once he gets there, like he's got to develop this balance. We get a very short chapter of him actually living in the North, and he has 2 more memoirs if we want to hear more about that. But he has to negotiate where it's like, I was once a slave, I experienced this emotional loss, I have seen this aspect of human nature, but ultimately I'm going to accept the traditions of this culture so that I can fit in and so that I can make some kind like social change. And that's ultimately like the way that these stories go. And I think that it happens for him constantly through language. So I think he's moving from this emotional loss of like having an age, actually being somebody who can participate in the rhetoric of the dominant culture. And as he experiences this journey, he learns more and more about how to communicate and what he needs to do to communicate, so that at the end, he's developed a kind of communication style that works for the traditional society that he's a part of. So I think it uses this Bildungsroman structure to show how he comes of age into language, how he learns how to use language effectively and persuasive strategies effectively. So, yeah. Not like Shrek, because Shrek does not start as a baby. Shrek is an adult. So some really famous Bildungsromans, like Huck Finn is the most famous probably. It comes from the German because there was a story of the sorrows of young Werther. Is a one.
Really?
Harry Potter these days would probably count. That would probably count as a coming of age of Bildungsroman.
Why isn't Harry Potter considered like a narrative you can write about
What do you mean?
in AP, the AP test?
Oh, because it's not. I love Harry Potter. Don't get me wrong. It's not good. It's not good writing.
It just-
I love it. It is great storytelling.
Obviously, Harry Potter is.
So it's good writing and good storytelling.
Harry Potter is very good storytelling and world building.
You're only saying that.
Sentence by sentence, Harry Potter is a pretty terrible book.
I'm trying to make.
But I love it. I'm not saying it's a great story.
She said that Star Wars.
Anything that doesn't start with the character in childhood is not a Bildungsroman. It's just a character arc. So a lot of the stuff you guys are naming is a character arc where someone starts like naive or experiences loss and then has to like go through things to like learn something. That's just every story. A Bildungsroman is about childhood growing up into adulthood and maturity. Yeah.
So Black Widow would be a Bildungsroman.
Yes.
Okay,
But
so-
the movie, the way it was represented, like in the movie, no, because we get barely anything of the Red Room. A Bildungsroman is going to be like all about their school experience, all about what the Red Room was, and then it would end when she like finds her sister.
So Guardians of the Galaxy starts with Peter Quill as a child. He loses his mother to cancer.
But how much of the book is him as a child? How much of the movie is him as a child?
Like 10
minutes. Yeah, it's like less than 20 minutes, right? So it's not a Bildungsroman.
So he has like 5 pages.
Okay, and then
Yeah.
there's like
But How to Train Your Dragon.
3 different parts.
How to Train Your Dragon is a Bildungsroman.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll
What?
You've watched How to Train Your Dragon?
Inside Out is a Bildungsroman. Inside Out is great. Yeah.
Inside Out
The whole
sucks.
time.
She's a
Oh
child.
my God.
She's
Wait,
a child.
Wait, what about Jungle Book?
Oh, is it being a child?
What about Jungle Book?
You're saying.
What about How to Train Your Dragon?
Oh, it's okay if he's the same. He's just achieving maturity. The Lion King is a good Bildungsroman, yeah.
What about Jungle Book?
Tangled, no.
Cinderella.
I don't think so. I haven't seen Tangled in a while. Here, I think we're getting confused and off topic, but I think you're getting confused because you're thinking that if there's a flashback in a movie, then that should count as a Bildungsroman. But the story is about their maturity. And so if the flashback is just showing like, here's what they are as a child, and now here's where they've ended up, you've missed the part that's missing is the Bildungsroman.
So wait, so if you need like lots of story time as a child, then what about specifically Dr. Doofenshmirtz, who's probably German, through the entirety of season for only when he's talking to Perry, who keeps.
I don't know, sorry. Noble.
It's Superman considered a
Smallville would, and all the other Superman movies would, because you usually skip Superman.
How is
As a
Lion King not
teenager.
skipping it? It's literally a song and now he's an adult.
There's like, I mean, a good,
He's a child, now he's an adult.
Lion King is like a good 30 minutes of him as a baby, right? And then it's like him as a teenager, and he has to go back and fit in.
And then he becomes an
Well,
adult.
But he doesn't,
Nothing
he's a,
nothing in
he's not.
That's true. That's true. All right, so are you understanding the concept and now you're just throwing out movies?
No.
And now I'm like.
Yeah.
If we're right, we might watch them.
Okay, so you're saying that it has to be, the age doesn't have to be like really spread out? Or
No.
does it just have to like?
It just has to be about the story of somebody coming into maturity from childhood into adulthood.
Alright, so how old would that be from?
It doesn't matter. It's just like when they experience that emotional loss.
I need like an actual, like a real example that I think is where we're getting caught up.
Okay.
They
This
don't
is the one
know-
I'm saying.
They don't know. That's very true.
Yeah, okay, but Harry Potter is one, right? Because he starts at like 12, right? And the majority of his story is in boarding school where he's having to like grow up
Oh,
into
and by
maturity.
the last book, that is when he's achieved his maturity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pokemon.
Yeah, no.
Okay, wait, so what if it's like a movie, like a lot of movies, you said that a flashback doesn't count, like what if half the movie is flashbacks and experiences?
It depends on what the movie would be then. Is it a story about a child coming into maturity?
That actually is a good question, but I'm
It's like lessons that.
I don't know.
He doesn't experience trauma.
Potentially, it just depends. Yeah,
He just goes to a university and he does
yeah,
maturity.
Tarzan is a great example of a bonus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh?
Brave.
Yeah, I think that one fits too. Yeah.
Now we're just trying to get like points. It's like over.
Now you've got it. Okay. So I want to show you how this creates a Bildungsroman then. So we talked. All right, take out your blue notes form now. Just the song, I guess, maybe. No, it's not. So you're taking, I need you guys back on track. Taking out your notes. And you have done titles and you have done counter arguments, right? But I don't think a lot of you have written down anything under rhetorical strategies or notes. Is that fair? Say, okay, cool. So for chapter 1, we did talk about some rhetorical strategies in chapter 1. We were talking about the very first few chapters where he's talking about not knowing his age. And we talk about him not knowing who his family was. And yes, okay. And then we talked about in chapter 2, we talked about the 2 forms of rhetoric, the forms of well, we talked about 3 forms of rhetoric in that. The oaths and the whipping as one kind of form of the slave master trying to persuade the slaves to obey. And then we talked about the singing as a form of rhetoric of the slaves kind of showing some rebellion. So jot down some notes on your blue sheets just to remember like what we talked about with these things. Jot down under rhetorical strategies, what are some strategies that you think he is using? So when we say strategies, we do not need to use terms like this all the time. You can, and I'm going to a little bit, but you can also use terms just like, oh, he states that he doesn't know his age. And that is a rhetorical strategy. That is something that he is doing to try to persuade his audience of something, right? Or he states he has some details about his parents, but not all of them. Ali Rose?
Do you have an extra pen?
Yes. So write down a couple just for chapter 1 and chapter 2.
But then she becomes the principal.
You want the literal title or title that fits?
A child fits most.
Yeah,
It's in the recording too. It's what we did last time.
I've seen that.
Oh, is that one?
Okay, do you guys have some stuff written down under there? I'm gonna give you like 30 more seconds, really quick.
Wait, Dr. Laura.
Yeah.
So for slaves to sing when they're sad, is that where blues come from? Like
Yeah.
Jazz?
Yeah.
Because they sung.
Uh-huh.
Jazz is the
Yeah,
one-
and you'll see how old like spirituals are turned into blues songs. Like they'll reference them and they'll quote them in blues songs.
Well, they talk a lot, like, there are a lot of old slave, like, songs that call back to slaves.
Yeah, yeah.
All in response in all, like every song. Slave poems.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to have you write down like the stuff that we actually talked about. You will get plenty of time to like think about how this fits in later. But I want to now go to chapter 3. So go to page 11 in your Frederick Douglass books. I'm gonna try and show you how I would go about writing this story or writing this thesis. Okay, so just to do some just to show you what's going on in my head as I'm trying to write this paper. I'm pretending that I am writing a paper about Frederick Douglass. And the first thing that I notice is that it's talking about the power of rhetoric over and over and over again. The second thing that I notice is because of that, it feels like it's this Bill Douglas roman. So this is the first thing I notice. This is the second thing I noticed. And since I knew that word already, I can kind of think of all the qualities that it has. So if I'm thinking about that, I'm like, okay, then I need to actually show that this is a sort of coming of age story into language. And when I'm looking at the first parts, I just actually, as I was reading, as I was noticing that about chapter 4, I started noticing how often it was talking about that. So I went back and I just highlighted it in green, all the parts where I felt like he was talking about speaking or they were talking about modes of communication between people. And so when I noticed that, I was noticing some things that he was doing. The first one I noticed, I guess I'm on 3 now, was that there was a juxtaposition between styles. So between slave rhetoric and master rhetoric. And that this was achieving this was creating this huge gap between the way that we were communicating that was very ineffective. We talked about this last time. So that was one thing that I noticed. No, sorry, those were in chapters 1 and 2. Now I'm in chapter 3 and page 11. And I'm noticing that he is talking a lot about how slaves have to speak a certain way. So it says at the bottom of, so there's a paragraph that starts the colonel after ascertaining where the slave belonged rode on. So he's talking on this page about this slave who was not on the property, and Colonel Lloyd stopped him, and the slave had never seen Colonel Lloyd before, and Colonel Lloyd says does he treat you well? And the guy is honest and says, no, sir. And was the ready reply, what does he work you too hard? And he says, yes, sir. Well, don't he give you enough to eat? And yes, sir, he gives me enough, such as it is. And so he's in ignorance, he is speaking the truth. And because he spoke the truth, he was immediately chained and handcuffed and sent to Georgia. So it says at the bottom of that paragraph, this is the penalty of telling the truth, of telling the simple truth in answer to a series of plain questions. So in that section, I notice a repetition of the word truth over and over again as he's trying to clarify this, telling the truth of telling the simple truth in answer to a series of plain questions. And it says that there is a maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. And he's talking about how I have been frequently asked if I had a kind master, and do not remember ever having given a negative answer. So it's all about how slavery forces to lie. And that this creates a kind of irony to the rhetoric. By that, I mean a thing that we do in order to communicate with each other is actually achieves the opposite of what it should achieve. If the way that we are supposed to use language is to communicate truths to each other, then because of the way that slavery works, language becomes the opposite of that, and it's meant to convey lies to each other. Okay, and then I look at page 24. So I'm noticing all this repetition and talking about language, and I look at 24, and I see that this is when he has actually been introduced to reading and the possibilities that it opens up for him. It says, well, sorry, go to 23, bottom of that page. Chapter 7. It says, the dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. Okay, so in that little section, he's talking about successful dialogue. We've had all of these examples of unsuccessful dialogue between people. Dialogue that has represented lies, or half-truths, or just is not communicating with each other, like is not having the desired effect. And yet here he reads this example of when it has had the desired effect. And he's reading this dialogue in the newspaper, in this paper, and it says, it represented the conversation which took place between them. First of all, tell me about that word conversation. How is this form of rhetoric different than any others you've experienced? Noah?
You haven't had the chance to have a conversation with the slave master. Have you ever had like an argument with someone who's like set on being right and like, you know, just talking to them? I feel like that's exactly what he was doing. He was like, hey, does he treat you well? No. Well, I'm getting ready to whip you, like no matter what you say. Almost. Like,
Yeah.
does he treat you well? No. So that's like,
Right.
there's an end goal. And so for this to be a conversation, that means like the master is willing to listen. And that's kind of like, I think that sets the slave free.
Yeah.
In the story, like the emancipation comes about the change of heart. And the slave master experience was willing to set stuff happen.
Right, right. Cameron?
I think the conversation was like more personal.
Yeah. Okay, so it's like part of it is like both sides have to be open up to listening and changing in some way. And there's a kind of equality there. So it's like in the way that it's talked about, the dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them. It's creating this equality between a slave and a white master. Yeah, Abby.
To kind of go along with that, I think you have to have like an equality in like the way you can communicate. So, like if he is like well educated, I guess you're gonna have a different conversation with someone else who's well educated.
Yeah, good.
Rather than having a conversation. You're gonna have a conversation with someone who doesn't know what they're talking about or like I guess can't relate.
Right. So there's like this actual possibility of them understanding each other too, because of the ways that they have like an equality of language. Awesome. Okay. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master. What is significant then about this experience for him? He's remembering this story he read as a child, and he is still remembering this dialogue in this story. Why is that a significant way to represent this conversation between the two?
It's just because he does have equality.
Yes. Yeah, Daniel.
Like kind of how he grew up in their kind of reading life of this slave, like new forms of communication as well.
Yeah. Right. So this slave like was, and it says it was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things. What about that was made to say? What does that part mean? Lexi? Well, in this case, it's describing a character in a story, right? So yeah, he doesn't really have a choice. Allie Rose, what were you gonna say about it? Okay, so it's this character in a story, Maxwell?
Like he grew up that way, like he kind of grew his ability to say things in that way. And so
Yeah.
the word made was like he was made to say this is like saying that's like how he is, like that's who he is.
Yeah. Have you heard of the phrase representation matters? That's a phrase that's tossed around a lot right now. What does it mean, representation matters? What does that mean in general? Allie Rose?
Having representation for every single majority or minority is something that is important.
Why would that be important? Like, why would, if you were, not represented on screen, why would it be important to see yourself represented on screen? What do you mean? Like to point that out to you, or? Okay, yeah, because other people aren't familiar with you. Yeah, Abby?
More relatable.
Okay, so there's a power in relating, right? Like, no.
I feel like almost the person who meant to say that, I was like kind of back to like almost like a religious sort of like viewpoint, almost like with the power of language, kind of like almost like it's almost kind of like his gospel, like he use it to
Like he was fated to say this thing.
Yeah.
Kind of, but okay, good. Like this was his purpose.
For me, because I just like
I get to listen.
It, like,
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. I think what he's talking about here too, though, is that there was a writer. There was a writer who was representing the dialogue between a slave and the master. And this writer chose to represent the slave as saying smart things. So it's this idea of representation matters where, like, okay, so for me, it's a very stupid one because I'm like a white lady from an affluent community. So I've always been on screen, right? But growing up in the 90s, almost all girls on, I very rarely related to the girls on screen because of like the things that they were interested in. Like I felt like this sounds so stupid, but I felt like straight girls. It was like every character that I would really attach to would have a coming out story, and so I would be like, maybe that's not like a possibility. Like it was very strange for me because there weren't really like masculine girls on television, if that makes sense. And so I was just like, I don't know how to like interpret this. And finally I remember watching Dexter, so dumb, Dexter, when I was like in my mid-20s, and there was finally a woman on Dexter, that TV show, not the cartoon, but like the one about the serial killer, that I was like, okay, there is like a masculine straight woman. That's like that, I see myself in that person, you know? And it was so important for me to see that because I was like, okay, so maybe I'm not having to question my whole identity now. I'm revealing too much here. Anyway, so like, it was important to me to see it as a possibility and to see that what I did like wasn't wrong, and that my limitation, like what I had thought of as my limitations, were not actually limitations, that someone who looked and talked and thought like me could be a real person, you know, that there could be other people like that. And so for him to read this story about a slave who said very smart things and spoke in this like elevated, like really persuasive language was really important for him to see that possibility as a kid. Does that make sense? So when it says he was made to, it was like the person who wrote this made him speak in this way. That was important. Yes, I think so. Cameron, what were you going to say about it?
Oh, I was going to say, like, I think that the representation, like, things like normalized, so like,
yeah, and when it becomes normalized, it's like what's normalized for him is that you can speak to someone and you can have a dialogue with someone that is so persuasive that it will lead to your freedom. Like this conversation had a desired, though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. So he has this story about successful dialogue. Story about successful rhetoric that I think was really important to him. And he uses this in references and allusions. It's references to the actual story that he read, and then it's allusions to kind of like the pattern in those abolitionist texts. All right, and then the very last thing that I notice in this book is the very last line of the book. So turn with me to page 68. And then one page after that. I'm sick of teenagers.
Oh, that's kind of I didn't even get it.
69.
All right, so the very last bit of this, he was talking about how he was working in shipyards, you know, and then he said, I went to this abolitionist meeting and I met this guy who suggested that I start speaking. And it says, it was a severe cross and I took it up reluctantly. The truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down. I spoke but a few moments when I felt a degree of freedom and said what I desired with considerable ease. From that time until now, I have been engaged in pleading the cause of my brethren. With what success and with what devotion, I leave those acquainted with my labors to decide. And so I think what really is important here at the very end, sorry, my board is getting so messy, but the last thing that I notice is that he refers to rhetoric language as his labor and cross. So we have another allusion here. We have an allusion to Christ, right? And that he has decided that this was kind of his labor. This is his purpose in life now, is to be this rhetorician and go around and speak to people and convince them that way, to do what he saw in the newspaper when he was young. Okay, so that was all just a way of showing you that I'm going through and I am looking for instances when I think he is building this particular argument. I'm starting with the argument. I'm not starting with the strategies. I start with the argument, I look where he's building that argument, and then I think about how he's using certain persuasive techniques in those little moments to build the argument. Does that order make sense to you? Okay, cool. So ultimately then I've got to format this into a thesis statement. So I'm going to erase my buildings Ramon stuff up here. And I'm going to try and put this as a thesis, which is going to be hard because I haven't written it yet. All right, let's say like, Douglas argues the development and engagement of abolitionist rhetoric gives power, language, the opportunity to make systemic changes. Because I want to talk in here about how his physical rhetoric is powerful and stands up to it. When he actually has that fight, it's such an awesome fight, isn't it? Like the description of it. When he has that fight, that is really powerful, but that was just against one person. But with rhetoric, he can change many, many minds. And this book had 5 printings. It was extremely popular. So he had this ability to make big systemic changes. All right, so that's when I do that. And I'm going to say, he makes this argument by using Bildungsroman structure, moving from juxtapositional and ironic failed communication to successful. Ooh, how would I say this? Okay, let's see. He made this argument by using the Bildungsroman structure and moving from a juxtapositional and ironic failed communication to a successful career as a rhetorician. Yeah, I think that's going to cover all my points. So in this, I'm going to be able to talk about the juxtaposition. I'm going to talk about the repetition and the irony of having to lie. I'm going to bring up references and allusions, even though I don't name them here. I'm going to be able to do that when I talk about how he moves from one to the next. And I'm going to be able to talk about the laboring cross stuff when I talk about his career. So I've also got this whole thing about structure. So I've got a ton of rhetorical strategies that I can talk about in this.
So like all those things are like what your paragraphs can be about.
Yeah, so when I'm thinking about paragraphs, your papers are going to be 3 to 4 pages, so you don't want to think about how each one is a paragraph. You're going to think about what does he do at the beginning of the story, what does he do in the middle, what does he do at the end, and
Because you are
move
talking
through
about
it.
the buildings from all.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we were talking about something else, that's kind of what we would just build it around.
If you were talking about something else, you would probably think about what does he do at the beginning and how does that kind of transition into what he's doing at the end. Yeah. Okay, this is just an example. My thesis statement here is 2 statements. That's fine. It could even be 3. I had to do that because my argument got clunky. And if you can fit it into one, that works too. I've just done it this way because that's what fits my argument. Elira?
How do you make the rest of your essay not like listy?
For me, it's going to be because I am following the structure of the book. And so the transitions are going to be provided by how he's transitioning between ideas. It's just going to change for everybody. Another way of thinking about it is that your thesis statement should contain a logical claim. So when we did claim types, your thesis statement could be a causal claim or a definitional claim or proposal, and that kind of gives you an idea for how the structure will go. Yeah. Rhetorician. Sorry, I was writing so fast.
Bro, you have very pretty handwriting, even
That's
when
more
it's
about
like,
having bad
quote,
handwriting,
like
so-
messy.
Thank you.
Right, like it reminds me of like Russian. Person, you
Yeah,
know?
that's me. All right. This is just an intro to what we are going to do. We are going to spend next class period practicing this, and then the 2 class periods after that practicing this. So if you're feeling lost at this point, or you're feeling like, oh, I don't know if I'll be able to do this for my paper, don't worry. We're gonna keep working on this. So we've got 7 more minutes, and I want to get started on the next thing. So for this, you're going to need a group, and it has to be like a full group. So we've got you 4 usually work together, right? And you 4 work together. And then do you 4 work together usually back there? Okay, and then you 4 work together. Is it you 3 that work together usually, or then you usually work? Sometimes with them, sometimes here. I'm gonna have this little L, and I'll have you guys sit by each other. Abby and Lexi and Sarah and Daniel are the group. Does that work? Okay, because then we get nicely, and we've got a group of 4 right here and a group of 4 back there. Oh, a group of 4 and Spencer. All right, yeah, a group of 5 back there then. All right. So what you are going to do is you know what I did up here? Well, no, it's not what I did up here. You guys are going to teach the class about one strategy that Frederick Douglass is using in his book. You're going to find a short passage, no longer than 2 paragraphs, and his paragraphs are really long, so you might even do half a paragraph or 1 sentence. You're going to find a short passage in his book that you're going to be able to come up here and present to the class and show them about this rhetorical strategy. And that's going to give everyone so many things that they could potentially write about. So it's our way of being generous to each other and sharing our ideas.
Are you going to get rhetorical strategy that way we don't all like?
No, I'm going to have you choose your top 3, and then I'm going to go around your top 3 passages that you want to examine. I'm going to go around and make sure that everyone's doing different ones.
We're starting that next time.
Well, we've got 5 minutes. So what I want you to do in your group.
And the rhetorical strategy is like what those, the numbers are, right?
Yeah.
That's like a rhetorical strategy.
We should start this next time. We've done too much thinking for today about cars and Shrek and so on. Yeah, okay. All right, sure. Yeah, we'll start on this. That's true.
My Little Pony and Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Avatar, from what I know, I haven't seen it, but I think it's gotta be.
Like his whole culture dies, and then he has to take the weight of the world.
It sounds like it's definitely
Yeah.
Zelda.
The animation
And
of
then My
it.
Little Pony. Actually, I don't know about the trauma part, but she has to
With My Little
learn how to be a princess.
Sure,
What
but
is Twilight
you'll have to
Sparkle
be
lose?
careful because the teacher that you're, make sure that teacher's not busy. You'll start off on a bad foot. But if they're doing something like this, it'll work.
Oh,
Okay.
she has to have friends.
She
That's
has
her
to have
function.
friends.
I'm so excited. I only have to go to AP. 2 more classes. And the work in there is all of it in the second quarter. So maybe I might need to do that. I'm excited.
You'd be late for this. So yeah.
Literally everyone in Avatar:
Yes,
The Last
so-
Airbender,
There's like
goes through that.
Yeah,
And maybe talk. And then Zuko. Zuko just loses his dog. And well, I guess he loses his
Yes. You got that drink.
You should make a reservation.
Yes. That's not possible. I won't be here next month. Yeah, we're doing these like presentation meetings, and I think next time it'll be like a lot of preliminary. And then probably get people in. And so you could, one, you could join us on Zoom if you want to. Actually, this is still recording. Let me.
I know.